You know, I often walk destroyed or abandoned ruins in my travels, and I always imagine what these places were like in their prime. Were these halls tense or relaxed? Were they filled with laughter or screams? But I've always found that if a building stands long enough, it has held all of those things at some point. The ruined vigils surrounding Ishgard are no different. These bastions of defense were once proud displays of Ishgardian determination and resolve. Now they're rubble, and time will turn them into monuments of a bygone era, as is the fate of all structures, eventually. Gather around, my friends. Today we'll be exposing the history and traditions of one such place, as we delve into the dungeons of Stone Vigil. The destruction of Stone Vigil and all the other ramparts of Ishgard is relatively recent history, as these locations have stood for hundreds of years, unflinching against the Dravanian hordes. While Stone Vigil is the focus of our lesson today, it was actually one of 4 defensive lines protecting Ishgard's western and eastern perimeter. Its sister locations were called Dusk, Dawn, and Steel. The Dusk and Dawn vigils acted as a sort of first major line of defense, with Dusk guarding from western invasion, while Dawn guarded against eastern invasion. These vigils got their names from the fact that the sun rises in the east and ultimately sets in the west. These 2 locations formed a sort of outer ring of defense, meaning that Stone Vigil and Steel Vigil acted as the inner ring. This also meant that Stone and Steel were the last solid line of defense for Ishgard's capital. This system was actually ingenious, as the vigils would stand strong for centuries against the dragons. Dusk and Dawn would take the brunt of a full-on attack, while Stone and Steel would take care of any dragons that snuck past the first line of defense. Some of you may be wondering why the dragons didn't just go after Ishgard from the south or north if those locations were so well fortified. While I can't speak for Nidhogg's brood, I can see the obvious flaws in attacking Ishgard from these directions, and that is exposure. Ishgard's north is almost completely open air between the capital and the northern mountain range of Abelathia's spine. There's absolutely nothing that would be hiding a draconic invasion from that direction, giving Ishgard's sentries a surplus of time to not only ready their defenses, but also take shots at the incoming dragons, who would have nothing to retreat behind once the anti-air barrage began. Meanwhile, Ishgard's south is technically the city-state's main entrance, so it's already the most heavily trafficked land in the immediate area. Being well-traveled also means being well-guarded. There would be no chance to attack from the south without being spotted by one of their many outposts, farms, or caravans that use these roads. This only left Ishgard's flanks as a sort of weak spot, as there was plenty of rolling mountains and hills to use for cover, and Ishgard's outpost became more and more sparse the further east and west one would go. This weakness was what the vigils were constructed to cover, and they did an amazing job at it. That is, until the Seventh Calamity. While Bahamut's rage didn't scar northern Eorzea nearly as badly as other locations, it did suffer one of the most obvious aetheric shifts that Aldenard has ever seen. Within the wake of the Seventh Calamity, the entirety of Kurthus steadily began to freeze, as the entire region was dramatically tilted in the direction of aetheric ice. Mind you, Ishgard was never a tropical zone, but it certainly wasn't the icy tundra many adventurers now know it as. This freeze would eventually starve the outer reaches of Ishgard, as many of their plants and animals weren't conditioned to survive such brutal cold for extended periods of time. The local farms and training grounds that once supplied and supported outposts like Dusk Vigil began to fail, and in time, Dusk Vigil was abandoned by the capital as a result. But what happened to this location in particular is a story for another day. With Ishgard's outer ring of defense completely compromised, there was nothing stopping the Dravanian horde from flying toward the inner ring and immediately beginning siege on the Stone Vigil. While it was a well-stocked and well-fortified position, the Stone Vigil wasn't made to face the full weight of the horde like the Dusk Vigil was. Not only that, but the consequences of the Calamity harmed this location as well, weakening it just enough for Nidhogg's brood to test their luck. At this point in time, the Stone and Steel Vigils were being led and supplied by House Halenart, one of the 4 great houses of Ishgard. Normally, this family's peerless ability to supply weapons and munition to their soldiers would ensure that the Stone Vigil would stand against the Horde no matter what. But the sudden cold had harmed their supply lines, and Stone Vigil was completely unprepared for the sheer number of dragons that would pass over Dusk Vigil and attack them directly. Despite their best efforts to defend this foothold, Stone Vigil would fall to the Dravanian horde. Not only that, but Ishgard lost the Steel Vigil around the same time. Now both their outer ring and inner ring of defense were demolished, and all eyes were now on their capital. Despite the freezing of Kurthus making terms of engagement more favorable for Nidhogg's brood, House Halenart losing both the Stone Vigil and Steel Vigil so quickly damaged their family's reputation, and is marked as the beginning of their steady decline in the eyes of the Holy See, eventually becoming the least respected of the four great houses. But what many don't know is that losing these vigils harmed the family internally even more drastically, as the Count's third son, Sir Claude was commander of the Steel Vigil at the time. He died, protecting it from the dragon called Svara. This would create a sort of rift between the Count and his four other children, as they knew that their father all but insisted that their now deceased brother be on the front lines for the honor and glory of their house. Nevertheless, the Stone Vigil was lost, and it didn't take long for the dragons to turn it into their stomping ground. There were almost always a few dozen dragons living within these halls, ensuring that Ishgard couldn't reclaim or refortify it, not without suffering heavy casualties. Stone Vigil would steadily become a dragon-infested ruin over time, but that would all change when the Scions of the Seventh Dawn moved to take something that was now among the wreckage of the once proud building. An airship called the Enterprise was seized by the Stone Vigil shortly after the Seventh Calamity, with the vessel's fate being unknown after the Vigil fell to the Horde. This airship was the sole reason for the Scions' desire to take a small task force through the ruins. After quickly moving through the Vigil, they came upon the airship in question, but only after an altercation with the Ascian La Habrea did they finally get airborne and fly the damaged airship back to Gridania. But this small victory inspired hope in some of the Ishgardian knights, especially the knights stationed at White Brim Front, a small fort located close to the Stone Vigil. White Brim is under the control of House Durendare, and it was ultimately the knights' pledge to this house that would attempt to seize Stone Vigil back from the dragon's claws. If the Scions were able to sneak through the Stone Vigil and retake their airship, perhaps the dragons had weakened their hold over the fortress, and now was the time to reclaim it. Led by Ser Drillmont, the Knights of House Durendare would storm the keep and attempt to take back the Stone Vigil by force. This move may have been impossible, but Ser Drillmont wisely petitioned aid from the same Scions that raided the Vigil last time, using their skill in fighting dragons and knowledge of the fort to their advantage. But this time was different, because after the Scions had raided the Vigil, heretics that pledged their allegiance to the dragons had begun filling these halls and providing much more needed support. But with the help of the Scions in question, the pushback was a success. Not even the heretics that turned themselves into savage dragons were enough to hold the line, as the combined might of the Drillmont forces and Scions broke their defense. Stone Vigil was once again under Ishgardian control. Although some would see this as a hollow victory, as the once proud ramparts of the Stone Vigil were now in complete disrepair. The dragons made sure that this place was a shadow of its former self, having caused no end of damage to the structural integrity of the fortress. But many more knights took heart. A win is a win, and with enough time and resources, Stone Vigil could once again become a shining example of Ishgardian tenacity and resolve. But that will be all from me for now. I don't know what plans they have for the Stone Vigil these days, but whatever they decide to do with it will be well earned. Because even before its fall, this place stood unshaken for hundreds of years, and with some work could stand hundreds more. In the meantime, take heart in whatever victories you claim, whether they be big or small. But until next we meet, stay safe, my friends. Thank you all for watching to the end. If you enjoyed this video, why not subscribe and share this with your fellow adventurers? With your help, I'll try to reach out even further and bring even greater stories to you. Although I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge my biggest contributors. A grand thank you to Papaya Cyan, Rovakis, Potato, Burn My Pancakes, The Yellow Couch, Sage Mouse, Vovolisoma, Sizani, Azuri, Nahil, and Ket, with an additional nod to the scholarships on screen. Links to things like my Twitter and that of my channel artist Caddy can be found in the description. Thank you all for your viewership as well as your support, and I hope all of you have a wonderful day. Class dismissed.